Speak quickly, Outlander.
After a violent storm, dozens of ships wrecked off the coast. So many bodies drifted ashore that the town morgue overflowed before even half of them had been collected. In desperation, the local clergy had to ask the fishermen to use their drying houses as makeshift morgues. For years, the sea continued to return the dead. Corpses would wash up on the beaches long after that fateful night, and the townsfolk buried them hastily in the graveyard of an abandoned church. These were not dignified burials. The bodies were wrapped in tattered sailcloth and dropped into waterlogged graves. One day, a priest from Byrum was summoned to the graveyard after another corpse was found on the beach. He gave the man his last rites, and the locals buried them as they always did. But that night, the priest heard a commotion in his courtyard. Though dread had already gripped him, he stepped outside, and there, stumbling about and shouting for the priest to show himself, was the very man he had buried only hours earlier. The priest recognized him for what he was, a draugr, a revenant. Without proper burial, the dead would rise from their graves, growing stronger and more violent with each passing night. No one in the household slept that night because of the unrelenting screams the draugr let out. But when dawn came, the draugr vanished. At once, the priest ordered the men to exhume the body and bring it to Byrum, where it was laid to rest in consecrated ground. This tale isn't from a book of ghost stories or from a novel. It is from the diary of famous Danish explorer Axel Friis, who was a man of science and who visited my island in 1924. He wrote about its unique flora, its rare birds and its hardy people, but he also wrote about something else. He wrote about the draugr, the sea drowner, a revenant, a being that shouldn't exist. And yet he recorded its presence as if it was just another bird, island native, or place name. And the most fascinating thing isn't that he isn't the only person who has documented these beings. And that is why I've long been obsessed with these kinds of stories, because while I don't personally believe them to be true, the sheer volume of stories about the dead rising from their graves and haunting the living is absolutely astounding, and it's fascinating. Because these aren't just tavern tales, they appear in newspapers, court records, they appear in official correspondence between respected government officials and even monarchs of kingdoms. And they are written in such a matter-of-fact way because they are official correspondence between these high-value people that you have to pull yourself back occasionally to a reality where the dead don't rise from their grave and seek revenge on the living. And that is what is different about the draugr compared to his mainland counterpart. Unlike the silent specters on the mainland that merely pointed the living towards where their corpses lie, these were different. They could speak, they were malicious, they could cause harm. They weren't mere ghosts, they were a curse. And I've collected all of the most interesting stories about them. And I've studied the natures of these beings, and I found out where they came from. And I want to tell you all about it, and the island that was cursed by the gods. During a harsh winter storm on the 11th of November 1858, the schooner Alexander of Guldholmen strands off Læsø's coast. The schooner was on its way from Flensborg to Göteborg with bricks. Everyone aboard died, and the sea claimed all of them, except the skipper, who washed up on the shore following the storm. Peder, who lives on the farm På Lynget, which translates to on the heather, had just been confirmed and was now legally considered a man. And like his father and older brother, he dreamed of becoming a sailor and sailing the seven seas. But his mother decided that Peder should wait a few years and help out on the farm until he was just a bit more ready. Angry and upset at the news, Peder went for a walk to clear his head, and he headed down to the beach to look out at the sea that was so alluring to him. In the twilight, he saw the body of a sailor. At first he was startled by the sight, but then he noticed the man's fancy boots. He could really use a pair of boots like that, he thought to himself. So he removed them carefully and ran back home through the dunes in the heathland. His mother had warned him about stealing from the drowned. She said that they will haunt those that wrong them. But that's probably just something she says to scare him, he thought to himself. He carefully placed the boots in his room, and then he collapsed on his bed from exhaustion. But in the middle of the night, Peder woke up to the sound of commotion and disturbance. He looked around and noticed that the sound was coming from the boots. He jumped out of bed and stuck his hand in one of the boots and was startled, and then he let go of it. There was something inside it. He could feel someone's toes wriggling about. He picked up the boots and sprinted back to the beach to return them. His mother was right about not stealing from the drowned, so she was probably also right about it being better if he waited a few years before he went off to sea. That story allegedly happened on a farm that is now a living museum that portrays what life was like before the age of electricity, and the being that Peder encountered was a draugr, and he used some kind of sorcery to punish Peder for his theft. Draugr is an interesting word. You can split it into two, sø and draugr. Sø means sea or any body of water really, and draugr is slang for having drank too much, usually alcohol. But in this case it's having drank too much of the sea and therefore drowned. So draugr means sea, drowner, except that it doesn't. Look at the creature, the draugr from Folklore. It is a being very similar to the one on the island that haunted the coast of Norway. Did you catch the name? Draugr, a sea draugr. Draugr doesn't mean sea drowner, it's just the word draugr with an accent. And that is what these beings on Læsø are, or rather were, and why they are so different from their mainland counterpart. They're sea draugrs, or rather island draugrs, not regular sea drowners. A draugr, or a barrow draugr as they would be known in Old Norse faith, was a warrior who had sworn their undying allegiance to their master. And by undying, that meant that when their master died, the warrior had to die too and be placed in the burial mound with their master. And here they would watch over their remains and the treasures that they were buried with, and they would fight off any would-be grave robbers that dared to disturb their tomb. In the sagas, warriors often had to slay a beast, and to slay that beast, they needed an artifact used by a hero before them who had used it to slay a similar beast, and they had to enter a draugr-infested tomb and fight off the guardians inside to be worthy to wield the artifact they needed in their quest, or to be worthy of an audience with a long-deceased master of the tomb who would give them counsel on how to succeed in their quest. To create a draugr, it was said that a person had to die in a position that was not lying down, so either standing or sitting, and a sea draugr are created in a similar way by drowning. They too do not lie down when they leave this plane of existence. They die in a state of suspension, a literal limbo. Similar to the sea draugr, the draugr of legend could be bargained with. They had some mastery of sorcery, and they would sometimes wander beyond their mounts when they got restless. And they were bound by rules, and they would punish those that broke them harshly. There are no accounts of draugr on the island during the Viking Age. They do not start appearing in our court records until the 1600s, and then they vanish by the mid-1800s. And I have a fascinating theory to explain why that is. Look at this passage from Axel Friis's travel journal. Previously, many more sea draugr ended up on shore than now, and it is because the sea is now consecrated ground, it said, and therefore does not give up its dead. Before that, there were many old people who had the gift of being able to hear the groans and moans of the draugr in the air. And when they stopped and listened to their cries for help, they would be able to see in their mind's eye, the place where the corpses were located, that the sea was giving up. Something in this passage caught my eye, because the sea is now consecrated ground. What does that mean exactly? Well, I think I might have found the answer, and it's way out there. Because like I mentioned earlier, what I find intensely fascinating about the island draugr is that they seem to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's all tied to the calamity that happened on the island and the gods that live here. Læsø today is famous for one thing, salt, and during the Middle Ages it was one of the biggest producers of sea salt in probably all of Scandinavia. The southern part of the island, it floods in the winter, and when the sea retreats in the spring, it leaves behind pools of water with a high concentration of salt. The islanders would then take the water from these pools and heat it over cauldrons at about 80 degrees, and the salt would make its way to the top of the cauldron and it could be collected. This process required massive amounts of firewood, and as the industry grew and grew, so did the demand for firewood. But what the islanders didn't do was plant new trees, so by the mid-1400s there were so few trees on the island that you could stand on the middle of it and see both the west coast and the east coast. But the islanders, they didn't stop there. Heather fields had been growing and spreading alongside the deforestation of the island, and when the islanders ran out of trees, they began cutting up the heather in turfs and using that as fuel. That would be disastrous. Underneath the heather there was sand, and once the heather was no longer there to keep hold of the sand, it would begin to move. Dunes would form, some as tall as 40 meters, which on an island that is completely flat would have been a terrifying sight. And most terrifying of all, the dunes, they would move. They would snake their way around the island and swallow anything in their path, like the Midgard serpent Jormungandr of legend. This event was called the Sandflight, and during it, a dune that it had given life to, which I have nicknamed the Dune Beast, made its way to the town of Hals on the east coast, and it swallows up the entire town and demolished everything in its wake, leaving only the church still standing, but just barely. And that seemed to have pissed something off. Læsø is the domain of Ægir the sea jotun and his wife Ran. They rule over the seas and they are the keepers of its dead. The island is their home and is where the gods come to feast. It's always been believed that their home is on the eastern part of the island in Bold Bay, as it seems to be the perfect place to greet visitors from Asgard. And Hal's church could very well have been their home before it became a church, as we do not know how old it was before it was swallowed by the Sandflight, unlike the two other churches on the island that we've been able to date back to the Middle Ages. We do know that there were Vikings living right near where the church was as late as the 650s, and we do know that a lot of Christian churches were built on top of funeral barrows, and if there was a settlement here, there would have been a barrow nearby where that dead could rest. And if you go to the place where Hals once stood, there is what looks to be a mound that very well could be the remnants of an Iron Age grave barrow. And the barrow could be Ægir and Ran's home because, in Nordic tradition, a home is not necessarily a home. It can mean an eternal home, a resting place, a grave barrow. While Ægir is usually known as a god, he is but a man in the sagas. He is a powerful warlock who is so well renowned that he is invited to Asgard to participate in a feast. And in return, he invites the god to Læsø to return the favor. So while he was powerful, he was immortal, and at some point he would need to pass on to the next life. And he would need a resting place. There are actually a couple of local legends that you could tie to Ægir's barrow. There is a figure on the island known as the Wandering Man. He walks right by my house and he's always heading east. You can see him in the distance, but you can never catch up to him. No matter how fast you walk, run or ride. He's been spotted walking in that direction for thousands of years, and he's described as being a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat who wears a long black cloak or maybe a coat, similar to the clothing that Odin is described as wearing in the sagas. We've of course always wondered why the Wandering Man wanders. It's been theorized that his appearance is a sign of bad things to come or a great change. But what if he's just stopping by for a feast at his old friend's home? And another thing I've noticed when reading about Ægir's feast was that trays of food were carried out by themselves with no servants in sight. There's a local legend that the grounds where the old Hals church once stood are always free of dew in the morning, and it looks like something has been dancing there all night, trampling down the grass and removing the dew. And the locals who lived in the area were sure that it was the spirits who were having a dance party when no one else was watching. And what if the trays that were carried out during Ægir's feast weren't carried out by themselves, but by invisible ghost folk? The same ones that also dance at night near what may very well be his home. These things would also explain his relationship with the world of the dead, that he himself exists somewhere in between the living and the dead, and that his dwelling is a gateway between the worlds. Ran, the wife of Ægir, was the one who would claim the souls of drowned sailors, and she would carry them to the afterlife. But after the destruction of the church in Hals, she stopped claiming the sailors and instead seemed to be sending them to the island, either as punishment for the destruction of her home, or because her access to her powers had somehow been cut off because her home had been desecrated. When the barrow she lived in, the possible gateway to the underworld, was buried under a mountain of sand. But regardless of the details, the draugur's reign of terror had now begun, and it became the duty of the islanders themselves to lay the draugr to rest. During the Age of Sail, there were a lot of beachings by Læsø, and a lot of drowned seamen. These people were dead, but there was still a life force within them. As long as they were out in sea, they had no connection to the living. But as soon as they touched the shore, they were granted the power to haunt the area where they lie, to make the living aware of their arrival. Old islanders say that when a sea draugur's chest touches the beach, he lets out a terrifying scream. The draugr only haunted until he was found and buried in consecrated ground, and when that happened, he would vanish and never bother anyone else. But until that was done, he would be extremely aggressive in his quest for rest. He yearns for internment in sacred ground, and therefore he shouts out the moment that he reaches, and the one who hears him must yell back, "Where lie you?" The draugr will answer and give up his location, and it's then up to the living to find him, and the draugr will appear as a spectre as the living get closer and point them silently toward where he lies. If you do not hear him, you will hear his footsteps near your house and the slushing of his water-filled boots. If he appears like that, it's often a sign of more sea draugrs to come. Sometimes he'll even yell out from the sea before he arrives. The sea draugr, at his core, is evil, not only towards those who cross him, but also towards those that don't. If you are followed by one, you must sit on the ground with your legs crossed and your hands folded, because then the sea draugr can't see you, and therefore he has no hold over you. If you don't, the sea draugr will sneak up behind you in the dark, and he will hang onto your back and plead for your help. As an emergency measure, you can draw your knife and stab once behind you to be freed. He will let go, and the day after you will find your knife where you will find the sea draugr. You must be quick and bury him, because if you don't and he attacks you a second time, and you once again stab behind you, you will stab yourself, and you will die. And that is what separates him from the traditional mainland revenant stories, and what connects him to the old draugr legends. He is vengeful, and he is corporeal when it suits him. It's dangerous to rob the sea draugr, but you can receive payment from him without fear of repercussion if you accept his bargain and fulfill your end of it. Once a poor man found a sea draugr on the beach who was still clinging onto a chest full of riches. The poor man began dragging the sea draugr up on the beach, and the sea draugr spoke to him. "He who buries me in sacred ground will have everything in my chest." The man buried the body at House Cemetery and took the contents of the chest. His newfound wealth and the rumors of how he acquired it caused a bit of a stir in his community. His neighbors tried to force the poor man to share the riches with him, but he made them follow him to the cemetery and where the sea draugr spoke from his grave. "What I have given you is yours, and no one shall take it from you without getting their fingers bloody." And after that, few dared to ask the man about his newfound wealth, and even fewer dared to think about taking it from him. Pity those that helped themselves to the valuables without paying the draugr back with a proper funeral. A man once found a draugr by Hornfiskeren south of Læsø, and when he examined the body, he found some gold coins in his purse. He pocketed the money and gave the draugr a hasty, improper funeral, and from that day on, he had absolutely no peace from him. The draugr would show up to his home and cast blame on him for not providing a proper funeral, a service that, according to the draugr, he had paid for with his gold already. Eventually, the man ended up going back out to Hornfiskeren, where he dug up the draugr and finally gave him a proper funeral at Byrum Cemetery. For the money he stole, he bought a chandelier which he gifted to the church, and allegedly it still hangs there today. A young girl and her mother were walking alongside the beach. They heard a terrifying scream yelling out, "Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no." The girl's blood froze to ice from fear, but her mother worked up the courage and yelled back to the draugr, "Lay calm, we will come and get you in the morning." And then the screamer stopped, and the girl and her mother returned home. They then told their neighbors about what they had experienced. And early the next morning, some of the men drove out to the beach, and they found the draugr and buried him. If the draugr was not found, he would sometimes go and visit the nearest farms to find someone to bury him. He would knock on the windows, but when people came out to see who was knocking, there would just be no one there. But if they yelled out, "Where are you?" he would answer and he would give them the location, and the day after he could be found at that very location. Other draugrs were less subtle. When the living came out to see who it was who was knocking, they would see a sailor standing in front of them completely soaked to the bone, and he would tell them where his body was, and then he would vanish into thin air. One time on a farm in Læsø, the residents heard how the outer gate was opened, and then saw a man walking into the courtyard wearing boots that were so wet that they were audibly sloshing. The woman of the house quickly nailed a cross to the door of the house itself, so the ghost couldn't enter. And then the next morning, the entire household were up extremely early, so they could find the draugr and give him a proper funeral, so he wouldn't give them a repeat performance of the night before. It was through the sea draugr's evil that the Great Plague in the beginning of the 18th century came to the island. An old man found a sea draugr at the beach, but when he wrapped his hands around the draugr to drag him to the cemetery, the sea draugr opened his mouth wide open and sprayed the old man with the plague. The old man died immediately after getting home, and at his funeral, as the coffin was being lowered into the ground, a black cloud erupted from it, and it slowly enveloped the gathering around the funeral procession. And shortly thereafter, everyone in attendance died, and that was the beginning of the plague's terror on the island. During the height of the draugur's terror, the islanders went to war with the dune beast. As it traveled through Højsande, they blocked its path with a barricade of dead shrubbery to slow it down to a crawl, and then they threw heather turfs onto its back to weigh it down, which brought it to a complete stop. And with that, the dune beast was defeated. For 100 years, the islanders would make a yearly journey out to its resting place to tend to its grave. Not to honor it, but to make sure that it didn't come back. They would mend any holes in its heather-clad coffin with twigs and then cover the twigs with sand to make sure that it stayed in place. A man named Svendstrøm Svendsen, a possible ancestor of mine and a man I will tell you about later when I talk about Jørgen Py, the trollcat, can be seen here leading a group of people tending to the beast's grave. It still lies out here in Højsande, and while I call it a grave, the beast is not really dead or slain. It is just resting, and over the last 10 years, holes have started forming around its grave. And who knows, it may one day rise from its grave like Jormungandr the World Eater and wreak havoc upon our communities for punishing us for not taking care of the land just like it did 400 years ago. With the dune beast slain, the north coast of the island was finally at peace, and the islanders built a new church near where the old Hals church was to replace it. Østerby Kirke finished its construction in 1867, and with it complete, it seemed like the age of magic and the curse of the draugr was over. A few draugr here and there would wash up on shore from time to time, but they were noticeably politer in their quest for peace. Nisser became an increasingly rare sight on the island's roads and pathways. The dwarf dune became quiet. Sticknils rarely appeared, even when people made jokes at his expense, and the trollcat on the island became fewer in number, and their abilities less powerful. The draugr became calmer and less intrusive, and we can see this in the stories that happened after 1867. The draugr no longer attacked people or wreak havoc or spread the plague, they just seemed to want peace. We can see it again in Axel Friis's own accounts. He went to the Norderrønner archipelago off the north coast of the island, and he interviewed the lighthouse keeper there about an encounter his grandmother had with the draugr. So, she was in service at a farm near Vesterø, and the owner was one of those old islanders that could hear the draugr. One day he stood outside his farm and he heard a faint cry for help yelling out, "I'm lying in Stordal." The voice repeated this many times, but when the man finally replied, "I'll come get you tomorrow," the voice quieted down, and the next morning the old man drove out to Stordal and found the draugr, and he provided him with a proper funeral in consecrated ground, and then the draugr was at peace. And we see the Cormo draugr again in the book Language on Læsø, which was a book about life on the island in the late 1800s. It actually features Svendstrøm Svendsen from earlier heavily in the narrative, but this time not as an associate of a trollcat, which is again a story for another time, or a tender of the dune beast, but as a hero who sails out and rescues the crew of a beached ship. The storyteller in this book mentions that supernatural beliefs have faded and that few believes in this stuff anymore, except the old folk. He tells the story of how his grandmother as a child was playing with some kids outside near Bangsbogård when they heard a loud yell for help. They ran inside to tell the bailiff, who was the owner of the farm, and he then walked outside and yelled back at the cries for help. "Rest until tomorrow and we'll be with you then." And just like that, the yelling stopped. The next morning he drove out to the beach and he found the bodies of 2 Swedish girls and brought them to the local priest, because it was his job as the bailiff to collect the draugr. The only time we see a cruel draugr appear after the construction of the church is a year after in 1868. An old roofer is tormented and tortured by his son and daughter-in-law. On his deathbed, he threatens his kin that as long as his nose faces the sky, he will be around and he will haunt them. He dies soon after, and the very same night that he passes, he comes back to haunt them. After being tormented for some time, the son and the daughter-in-law sneak into the cemetery where he's buried, and they unearth the old guy and turn him nose down in his grave to put him to rest. Whether or not that helped is unknown, but they were both charged with grave desecration, and we have surviving court records of the trial that unfolded. But I don't think that old man was a draugr. Long before there were stories about them, there were stories about dødninger, or revenants as they would later be known in English. These beings also appeared elsewhere in Scandinavia, and in places like Norway they actually went to war with the draugr and defended the living from them. In ancient Norse legends, a dødning was a warrior who was slain in battle and carried off to the afterlife, but who was unable to find peace in the halls of Valhalla, and therefore had to return to the world of the living to finish his business. The most famous story of a dødning is Læsø's own Helge Hundingsbane from the sagas, who returned to his wife to say farewell, and the island actually has its own version of this tale. A young girl sat with her housekeeper and kept watch over the patron of the house's body, who had recently passed. There was then a tap on the window, and the girl opened the door to the outside and saw that it was her betrothed. He was a man who was a dragoon in the military over on the mainland and who had gone off to fight in one of the wars. He asked her to follow him, and she did, and they walked in silence for a while, but then he turned to her and he asked, "Is it true that you will follow me in life and death, like you have promised?" To which the girl replied, "Of course." They arrived at Hell's cemetery, and there the dragoon tied his horse to a post and asked his betrothed to follow him inside to the holy grounds. And then he asked, "Are you afraid of me?" And the girl replied, "No, I am not." He found a shovel and started digging. The girl was then suddenly reminded of the unsettling nature of her promise, and she realized that her betrothed must be a revenant. The girl then ran home to her housekeeper, who had barely laid eyes on her, before she exclaimed, "I can see that you have been in the hands of a revenant." The girl and her housekeeper then made sure to turn the body of the patron with his nose facing down, so that he wouldn't come back to haunt them like the dragoon. The draugrs weren't the only thing on the island that was changing. Life here was changing. It was time for the men to come home from the sea and be part of their households, not just infrequent visitors that their wives had to put up with for a few months every other year. By 1924, when Acton Friis visited, he sensed that something was changing, almost like there was something in the air. He knew that the island's unique way of life was over. The islanders themselves just hadn't realized it yet. Its customs, its traditions, and its people changed, and by 1960 they were just like everyone else in the kingdom. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think life was better or worse back then. I just think it was different, and I think it's important to preserve the memory of how things used to be. And I hope you've liked this look at the unique folklore that shaped the lives of the people around here. Thank you for watching. I'll see you sooner rather than later.
Driving into the storm.